Okay, let's do this. Hello, welcome to $5 Flicks. My name is Michael Willer, and this series is called Crash Course. Basically, my other series are more about tips that you may not have thought of from a mindset point of view or learning from my past mistakes. And this is more taking my experience as a filmmaker who's been living and working in Los Angeles for almost a decade and applying it from a real world point of view. This video is going to be about writing and development and basically getting your story started. I find that this part of the process is a lot more finicky because, and this is where I trip up the most, because most of the time writing is done in a solitary way, and to that end, you're not really held accountable to anyone but yourself, which means that a lot of times you're the only person who's forcing yourself to move forward. And for me, I find that a lot of times that becomes a reason to say no. So here are some ways that you can actually keep yourself honest and move forward with something that's actually going to get made. Because at the end of the day, my channel is all about helping you get your story made, like actually get it done. So the first thing I can tell you about writing, based on being a writer myself, but also working with other writers, people in development, from executives and producers at companies like Disney, all the way down to like the little guy like you and me, friends of mine who are aspiring writers, myself included, is that you have to dig into something that makes you completely fascinated. Whatever weird thing it is that you're fascinated by, interested in, that is inherent to your personality, to your life experience, whatever it is that just gets to you, that like leaves that like smile on your face, or that whatever that fascination is, that's where you have to start. Because if you start with something that you're a little less interested in, or you're trying to do it for maybe a different reason that's less authentic, like you want to be mainstream, which for a long time I was falling into that trap. For years I was falling into that trap of like trying to be mainstream or acceptable or more popular, or mimicking popular movies instead of just being authentic to who I am, which is a little more offbeat than that. You have to start there, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a subject to write about that's going to continue to fascinate you through a very long process, you're going to lose interest halfway through. Or at the very least, your writing is going to be uninspired. Pick something that is a story that only you can tell, and I would really encourage you to hone in on emotional investment. What are you invested in emotionally as a human being? What makes you feel? It could be positive or it could be negative. I don't like the idea of negative emotions, but like, what makes you pissed off? What makes you overjoyed? What makes you cry? What makes you feel something deeply? What kind of story would that be? What would it look like? What would it feel like? And even if you don't know how to write at all, you know how to dig into something like that, because it's so inherent to the core of who you are that you couldn't help but write it. You couldn't help but go out and tell that story. That's where you got to start. Read your own dialogue out loud. Dialogue, I think, is the hardest part of writing, because that's the part of your writing that will actually get directly translated to screen. Like everything else, as far as the action that you write, the descriptions that you write, none of that stuff really gets directly translated on screen. A lot of times it gets interpreted through somebody else's point of view, or it grows, it develops. A line of action might say, and they fight. Period. But then it turns into an entire fight scene that a stunt choreographer is going to interpret, or whatever. Maybe you're going to do it yourself. Dialogue goes straight to screen. And a lot of times it's really easy to fuck that up. A lot of times dialogue sounds stilted. A lot of times it's hard for the actors to be authentic in their character because the dialogue doesn't come out of their mouths naturally. Read your dialogue out loud. Even if it's just with yourself, if it's with another person, even better. And I guarantee you'll hit upon spots where you get like kind of a tingling, or like a flush of embarrassment, or some kind of emotional reaction that will cue you to the fact that that's a bad line. Maybe you're trying to force an emotion into a line that doesn't actually need to be there. If you hear it out loud, I promise you that you'll be able to write it better in the long term. Is this vital information? Is what you're writing in your screenplay necessary for whoever's reading it to understand what's going on? And I know that a lot of people have an approach to writing screenplays that's like, it's like poetry, or it's about entertaining the reader as much as it is about conveying information. And that can be true, sure. Certainly you want to keep your reader engaged, but the ultimate purpose of a script, of a screenplay, is to be a blueprint for a movie. You're not showing the audience a screenplay. Like you're showing the audience what the screenplay gets made into. And for that to work, it has to be crystal clear. It has to be easily understood by everybody who reads it, so that whatever, artistic flourishes you want to include in the screenplay as far as being entertaining or funny in the description, things that aren't actually going to be heard on screen like the dialogue, becomes secondary and supplementary. That's stuff that you can add in a third or fourth draft once you've actually got the bare bones essentials in place. So focus on what the absolute essential information is first. That's not to say that you shouldn't ever worry about doing like the fun kind of writing, because a lot of times that's what's going to keep you interested as a writer. But my point is, if you find yourself stuck in a scene because you're trying to find the perfect description for this new character, just put literally the piece of information that somebody needs to know about them, and move on. Because you can always come back and add to it if you want. Focus on what is absolutely essential, and the efficiency of your word will carry you through to the end. Because I promise you, having talked to a lot of people who read scripts for a living, the number one turnoff for them, in most cases, is writing that is self-indulgent. Writing that doesn't get to the point. And I promise you, they'll read the first 5 pages of your screenplay out of obligation. And if it doesn't hook them in those first 5 pages, or if it doesn't show them some kind of promise that you know where you're going with this, you're gonna get a page of notes and it's gonna get thrown in the trash, if you're lucky. So this is kind of a weird one, but if you want people to like a character, if you have a hero or a friend of a hero, whatever, that you want to be relatable to people, just a thing that I have found that really helps an audience connect to a character that you want to be likable is have them do something very relatable. And it can be small stuff too, like have them eat lunch. Have them actually eat food. Like it's a weird thing, but having people do things that an audience recognizes inherently without having to think about it becomes very relatable. Like, why do you think that Brad Pitt's always eating in his movies? Like, I think he may have like kind of an oral fixation, but the point is it's kind of an endearing trait. It humanizes that person. Have them blush at a compliment, have them show a little bit of vulnerability, have them do something kind. There's a reason why Save the Cat is a book, actually 2 books. About screenwriting, which I highly recommend. Think about Devil Wears Prada. Like, our main character, the opening montage is her doing human, relatable things compared to all of the other glamazons who are dolling up and getting pretty and picking out perfect clothes, and she's eating an onion bagel before she goes to an interview, and she's like rushing around like a real person would, and she misses her cab or whatever. Like, there are things that you can do very simply to make somebody relatable and likable, and that is something I would recommend. So this next tip is tricky because it depends a lot on your own confidence in your own writing and your own ideas, but be careful about how quickly you introduce feedback into your writing process, and be careful about how much of that feedback you take into your rewrites. I kind of did a full circle on this one, where very early on, when I was just expressing myself and throwing my shorts and my shit out into the world without really thinking twice about it, I was just writing whatever the fuck I wanted to, and I was throwing it out there, and I will not say that any of it was any good, but I got it made. Like, I actually finished those projects because I wasn't wasting a lot of time worrying about what other people thought. Now, feedback can be completely invaluable, and I don't think you should lock people out of your process. What I'm saying is be very careful about how much feedback and how many different points of feedback you get. Because as valuable as somebody's feedback might be, it might be completely wrong for your story. That might be a great piece of feedback for somebody who's making an action thriller, but you're writing a serious drama. You're writing a simple, serious drama. And most people who are giving you feedback are probably not going to understand how to give you feedback that you need. A lot of times they're just going to give you their opinion and their reaction to your story with no other consideration. For instance, I have a friend who works in development, and he's really good at giving feedback that will help you with your specific story. And he understands how to dig to what you're trying to get to and to give you the feedback that will help you get there. And you have to learn how to take what people tell you and interpret it, and pick the stuff that you think is relevant and pick the stuff that you think is irrelevant and will slow you down. And my advice early on, don't get any feedback at all. Don't tell anyone about your idea until you have a first draft start to finish. And I'm not talking about an outline, I mean a screenplay. It could be a 15-page short film, or it could be a 105-page feature film, or anything else. Finish that first draft first, and give yourself time to read it before you ask people for feedback, because a significant piece of feedback could change the entire process following after that. And that's a huge change. And I have found that in stories that I have written that I haven't finished, a lot of times I wrote it and I felt very insecure about it, and I felt like I needed validation, and what people gave me was genuine feedback and not just validation. And I took their genuine feedback, and a lot of times it wasn't actually what I needed to dig further into the story that I was trying to tell, to dig into that weirdness, that uniqueness that I was getting at. It was their version of how to make it more relatable to them, or how to make it a little bit more mainstream, or what is an audience gonna like. A lot of times, like out in LA, people are obsessed with what is an audience gonna like, how's an audience gonna react to that? And for better and worse, I've learned a lot of those lessons, and I'll impart them upon you. But it's also really important, especially early on when you're writing, when you're still developing, to just get the weird shit on the page first. Avoid getting too much feedback, or if you do go for feedback, get it from one person that you really trust. Get it from one person who can help guide you, who you really understand their point of view and how it's going to affect your point of view, and work with them closely. But the more voices you involve in this process, the more watered down your voice is going to be. And at the end of the day, if your voice doesn't come through in your story, you've failed. I think there's very few ways to truly fail as a filmmaker, because we all fail forward, right? We all learn from our mistakes and we do it better the next time. But if you make something that gets so watered down by other people's points of view and opinions and rewrites and changes and like dislikes about things that you actually feel very passionately about, you have failed. And I say this having done this myself, absolutely having done this myself. And I consider very few of my projects to be complete failures, even though most of them are not that good. I'll admit that. But there's one in particular that I'll get to in the series of mistakes that is truly a failure, because I let way too many other voices in, and it watered the whole thing down, and it took it to a place where something that I felt very personally and very deeply became something I couldn't even recognize anymore. And unfortunately, this was after I had spent a ton of money on the production, and I took it into post, and I had barely survived that production, and I watched my footage and I said, I don't even recognize this anymore. This is so far from my original idea when I was developing this, that it was heartbreaking to look at it and see that this is not my story anymore. This is some watered down amalgam of a bunch of different people's voices. And ultimately, even though they were all people I trusted, I didn't get random opinions. I picked people in my life that I trusted, but they were all telling me things that were slowly drawing me away from what was making that story unique and weird. And it's a vulnerable position to be in, to put your voice out there in such a strong way, in such a way that you stand by it and you say, no, this is my weird thing, and I want it to be this. It's hard to do that, and I was insecure at the time, and I still am to a degree, but I've learned from that mistake that you have to try and stand by your writing at least enough that you can get that first draft done, because then you have seen the whole thing once. And now you have an objective point of view on it, that if other people start filling in, you know how that change early in the script is going to affect the end, because you have the end written now. This part of the process is the easiest one to tell yourself no. I started with this at the beginning of this video, and I'll repeat it again because it's so important. There's a reason that writer's block is a thing and editor's block is not a thing. Like when you're editing, when you're sitting in post, you are always beholden to somebody else, whether it's you're working with a director or a producer, or it's your own thing, but you now have footage that you are working within a constraint, and you know what it has to turn into. And so you're beholden to your own project at that point. When you're writing, it's completely raw. It's pure creation. Like there are literally no constraints. You can write whatever you want. It may not get produced, but you can truly write anything, and that can be paralyzing unless you stay true to the ideas that make you feel and avoid as many different ways of saying no to yourself as possible. And a lot of times that comes from outside voices. A lot of times it comes from being stuck on a scene If you find yourself stuck writing a scene, it's probably because that scene is boring you. It's probably because you're not excited about whatever that scene is. If you're writing a scene of exposition and you find yourself stuck on whatever it is that you're trying to get across because you just need people to understand these 3 facts about your sci-fi world for the rest of the story to make sense, but you can't write that scene because it's so dry, try combining it with something else. Try taking the next plot point in your movie and weaving it together with this point of exposition. And what happens when you change your story a little bit, when you condense it a little bit, when you make it a little bit more efficient, but you also challenge yourself to combine 2 things that you had not originally planned on doing. When you're working within that kind of constraint, it forces you to come up with creative solutions. And trust me, having gotten stuck on 1,000 different scenes trying to write them, giving yourself constraints forces you to start thinking about them. When you feel paralyzed when you're writing a scene and you sit down and you feel paralyzed by what it's supposed to be, what your vision of this is, it's got to be this because this is what leads to the next thing. Throw that out the door and challenge yourself in some way. Come up with some kind of constraint or requirement for how this scene can go in a different direction. Combine it with a different plot point. Get it across in a different way. Change the setting, change the pacing, have people, like the walk and talk is a famous example of getting exposition across because you at least are adding a sense of energy and momentum to things that are going on. And when you are moving characters through a space, you are inherently inviting other opportunities for outside input to come through. Like imagine Scrubs, where they're walking down the hallways and they're discussing a patient, and then somebody comes through and says something and hands them a clipboard and keeps moving on. And now you have an opportunity for a joke because you had some kind of impetus for another thing to get added to your scene. It will force you to think about things in a different way. And if you find yourself stuck, instead of saying no, instead of coming up with an excuse not to write it, try and figure out a way to challenge yourself and to start coming up with creative solutions to that challenge. And that, at the very least, will get you thinking about things again. And starting that thinking process is a hell of a lot better than sitting back on your bed and your phone going like, fuck, I should be writing right now, but I do not want to get onto that scene. Like, I can't imagine trying to write that fucking scene right now. It'll help. So, I feel like I have blathered on long enough. There's certainly plenty of other stuff to talk about with writing, and who knows, I might come back and do a part 2 of any number of these videos. But what I want to do with this is go in order, like literally go down the filmmaking process in order from start to finish. And it's not just going to be the creative stuff. It's going to be producing. It's going to be how do you make your things for no money. I mean, that's basically the whole point of this channel, is helping you become a self-sustaining filmmaker where you can make your movie and actually get it finished. And a lot of times it means doing things for as little money as possible. A lot of times it means coming up with creative solutions for problems. And if you can find ways to do all of those things, I am absolutely going to try and help you there. So please like and subscribe. I'm just launching this channel, but I hope it's helpful for you. I'm going to be doing a couple other series of videos, top 5 tips, and also a series of mistakes, which is me breaking down my past failures and successes. And I've worked on dozens of shorts and features and documentaries and web series and all that good stuff. And I want to break down as much of it as possible and tell you the real world lessons that I learned on every single one of them. Because there's been a lot, and there will continue to be more, because I'm not going to stop making movies. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.